From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the first meeting of the Washington Area Group for Cultural Studies for the 2017-2018 academic year. We do 6 meetings a year. We do September, October, November. We do February, March, April. And we have a very wide open idea about print culture. Anywhere, anytime is our mantra. And we've also done a lot of digital humanities, technology presentations in this group as well. So if anybody is local or not local for that matter, if anybody would be interested in talking to us at any time, we're always happy to hear about that. How long? We've been doing this more than 15 years. Maybe knocking right at 20, which is kind of frightening sometimes when we think about it. But it's been a roaring success. And in all that time, we've never had a bad day. Never.
Yeah, we're putting so much pressure on Paul.
And we know this is going to go right in the annals of that as well. But we conceived of this group when we started meeting as everybody local and anytime, anywhere, because there were a lot of people in the area locally who were interested in print culture studies, and there was no forum, there was no outlet, here locally, and that's what we aimed to serve, and hopefully we've done that. We've done that a little bit. We have a reflector email list that if you're not on their list, if you talk to myself or my colleague Eleanor Shevlin, at some point in today's proceedings, we would love to get you on the list. We have a website. Our schedule is up there, and we're going to be having Tony Lee, who's one of our attenders, going to speak to us. Victoria Burke, who's going to be at the Folger. Jason Farman from the University of Maryland, who's doing a lot of really interesting media transmission stuff. We've got an exciting program that we're excited about. So we hope if you're in the area, you can join us for as many of those as possible. We go for drinks and dinner afterward. It's a great place to continue the conversation, meet folks. I think we're a pretty congenial group. We have a good time doing that, and we invite you to come along if you're interested in coming along for that. So we're doing something new. We're webcasting. So we're going to be working to, what do you call it? Get the blocking right. I guess is what we're going to be trying to do. So this is a new adventure for us certainly, and I think the Library of Congress maybe to a certain extent. We're very grateful to the support we've had, especially from John Cole when he was with the Center for the Book here at the Library of Congress, and now Mark Diminution in the Rare Books Division have been more than wonderful to help us with this group. So Eleanor's going to give our speaker today, Paul Saltzman, who's with us all the way from Australia, an introduction, and we'll move on to the heart of the matter.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be giving a short introduction so we can hear and spend a lot of time listening to Paul. I will just add that next week, our next meeting is October 6th with Michelle Troy from the Albion, who has worked on the Albion Press, and her book will be coming out. Today, we are very pleased to have Paul Salzman, FAHA, is an emeritus professor of English literature from the Trobe University, and he's recently been appointed a professorial fellow at the University of Newcastle in Australia, so he is from quite far away. He is published widely on early modern literature, and his most recent book is Literature and Politics in the 1620s, Whispered Counsel, 2014. He's here on a Folger short-term Shakespeare, Folger Institute Fellowship, and he is working, the project he's going to be speaking about today and the work he's doing there is related to his next book. It's title of today's talk is Scrapbook Shakespeare, James Orford Holloway Phillips, and the preparation of a 19th century Shakespeare edition. Let's give Paul.
Thanks. So I'm going to start by giving you a quick guided tour through the history of Shakespeare editions before we reach the mid-19th century, which is where we're going to be for most of my talk. And some people here are going to be very familiar with what I'm going to start by outlining, so you can nod off at this point, and I'll let you know when to wake up, which will be when we reach James Orchard Halliwell in the mid-1650s. So to start with, about half of Shakespeare's plays were initially published individually in a form known as a quarto. Quarto is approximately the same size as a modern paperback and was seen as similarly ephemeral. Some of the plays were published more than once in the quarto format, perhaps most famously Hamlet, which appeared in two quite different quarto versions in 1603 and 1604. The very first publications, the very first Shakespeare publications, were in 1594, when what we now call Henry VI, Part 2 and Titus Andronicus were published. It was only 7 years after Shakespeare's death that his plays were gathered together and, you might say, were edited for the first time. The first folio, published in 1623, large numbers of them sitting at the Folio Shakespeare Library just around the corner, was put together by John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who were important members of Shakespeare's acting company, The King's Men. Contains new texts for the plays previously published in quarto and 18 plays that were never previously published, making a total of 36 and establishing Shakespeare's canon, though that canon did end up being challenged in various ways from the later 17th century through to the present day, when the attribution scholars are currently having a bit of a field day on who wrote what compared to Shakespeare and Marlowe. For the rest of the 17th century, 3 further folios appeared, and each one could be said to be a revised but unauthorised edition of Shakespeare's plays. So the second, which was published in 1632, was edited to include minor updates of spelling and punctuation. The third, 1663, is significant because it was published just after the restoration of the monarchy meant that the theatres, which of course had been shut for nearly 20 years, had reopened and Shakespeare's plays were being performed again. For the second impression of this edition, 7 new plays were added. All of them except for parts of Pericles are now considered to be apocryphal. And finally, in the 17th century, the 4th folio was published in 1684 and was essentially a reprint of the 3rd, although it's a significant volume because it served as a source text for many of the 18th century editions of Shakespeare. So the publication of these restoration folios coincides with the revival but also the adaptation of Shakespeare's plays in the new reopened theatres. For example, Dryden's adaptations of The Tempest and Antony and Cleopatra. And this was the historical moment when Shakespeare was, to adapt Ben Jonson's tribute in his dedicatory poem in the folio, suddenly seen as not for all time, but rather of an age. Dramatists felt it was necessary to drag Shakespeare into the second half of the 17th century. So this is when we had to take the most famous example, Nahum Tate's adaptation of King Lear, which was written in 1681, and which alongside many other alterations gives the play a happy ending. Tate's version of Lear dominated the stage for much of the 18th century, although it too was altered in various ways. The editing of Shakespeare in the 18th century was inspired by a similar idea, which was that Shakespeare was certainly a genius, but he was an antiquated one who had to be improved by an editor in order to be comprehensible. The 18th century was when Shakespeare began to be edited in a way that we might recognise as modern editing. His language and punctuation were modernised, editors annotated passages that needed explaining, and they changed words and phrases that they considered to be mistakes, whether the mistakes were made by early printers or possibly even by Shakespeare himself. Unfortunately, from the very beginning, editing seems to have gone hand in hand with mean-minded, bad-tempered rivalry between editors, something I'm afraid to say that continues to this very day. Setting that aside, in the 18th century there were great editors of Shakespeare, but they didn't really produce great editions. In 1709, with the publication of the collected edition edited by Nicholas Rowe and published by Jacob Tonson, whose firm was to maintain a tight hold on Shakespeare during the century, the structure of collected Shakespeare editions was set in a format that perseveres to the present day. This 6-volume edition begins with a biography of Shakespeare, with Rowe excusing this with a formula that was also to become common during the period. He says, "Though the works of Mr. Shakespeare may seem to many not to want a comment, yet I fancy some little account of the man himself may not be thought improper to go along with them." This hesitation over biographical details and the necessity of them was to shift quite dramatically, so that by the 19th century every possible biographical tidbit related to Shakespeare was treated with reverence, including many that were of doubtful veracity. Rowe also established the practice of regularisation of things like act and scene divisions, as well as standardised cast lists at the beginning of the play, along with the modernisation of spelling and punctuation. Rowe based his text on the 4th folio, and again he set a precedent whereby most of the succeeding 18th century editions simply built on their immediate predecessors. Alexander Pope's edition followed in 1725, an edition that quickly attracted controversy because Pope went much further than Rowe in correcting Shakespeare's text in a move that we might see benignly as one major poet reproducing another in line with the literary taste that prevailed a century after Shakespeare. Apart from Pope, the most famous writer who edited Shakespeare in the 18th century was, of course, Samuel Johnson. Johnson's 1765 edition became famous for his commentary and his much-quoted preface, rather than for its textual authority. The preface contains Johnson's axiomatic reflections on Shakespeare's universality, including the much-quoted phrase, "Nothing can please many and please long, but just representations of general nature." Johnson exemplified the idea that I've been suggesting is reflected in 18th century editing practices in general. That is, that Shakespeare needs to be extracted from his historical context and helped by editors to be confirmed as universal, as not of an age, but for all time. Johnson's edition was revised by Stevens and then by Reed, and Johnson exemplifies another significant aspect of Shakespeare editing that again has had an influence down to the present day, and that's the practice of incorporating earlier editors' annotations and often their emendations into successive editions. The idea that each edition built upon its predecessor was really only countered by an edition of Edward Capel that was published in the 1760s. It was Capel who pioneered the idea of returning to the source, so that he actually collated the original quartos and folios, producing thoughtful emendations that are still referenced by current Shakespeare editors. Unfortunately for Capel, his achievements were overshadowed by the work of Edmund Malone, the first editor to be considered, at least by modern scholars, as someone who approached the methodological rigour required for a more reliable and somewhat less subjective approach to the plays. Malone tried to determine a chronology for the plays, which had in previous editions been gathered together under the generic categories that they'd been gathered together in the first folio, with The Tempest coming first and Cymbeline coming last. Malone's edition was a benchmark for authenticity, given his careful use of early texts, especially his use of the first folio. The influence of Malone's work was consolidated after his death by an expansion and revision of his edition that was undertaken by James Boswell Jr. Published in 1821, this revised version of Malone became known as the Variorum edition because it incorporated so much of the material from earlier editions, reprinting the prefaces from the editions of Pope, Tybald, Hanmer, Warburton, Johnson, Capel and Stevens. and using many of their annotations. This edition held sway as authoritative until the middle of the 19th century, when in terms of editorial rigour, it was superseded by the so-called Cambridge edition in the 1860s. So it's this point that I want to talk about James Orchard Halliwell. So you can wake up if you were sleeping until this point. But I just need to say a few more things about the state of editing in the mid-19th century. The most significant and, in the end, notorious event in the editing of Shakespeare in the 19th century was the announcement in 1852 by the eminent scholar J.P. Collier that he had come upon a second folio filled with emendations in an early 17th century hand. Sorry, it's not very easy to see that photo. Collier's discovery caused a great stir, which he capitalised on, first with a book containing a selection of the emendations, which he considered to be by an early owner of the folio, whose name, Thomas Perkins, was inscribed on the front of the volume, and then in his 1857 edition of Shakespeare. Suddenly the subjective alterations and emendations of modern editors could be weighed against the bedrock of someone who was not only close to Shakespeare in time, but, Collier implied, perhaps possessed early manuscripts that gave Perkins's alterations to the text considerable authority. And this authority, of course, was transferred to Collier himself until the whole situation began to unravel as people became suspicious. The folio was finally examined by various experts in the British Museum, and it became clear that the Perkins annotations were written in a modern hand, pretending to be a 17th century hand. It's at this point in time that James Orchard Halliwell, who had taken a cautious approach to the denunciation of Collier, even though he was certain that the Perkins emendations were spurious, began work on what was to be the most ambitious and expensive Shakespeare edition of the 19th century. There he is in a very handsome pair of trousers. Halliwell was born in 1820, and even as a schoolboy, he began collecting books and manuscripts. Halliwell then went to Cambridge, where he was at Trinity College as an undergraduate, and then later at Jesus College. He had a particular interest in scientific and mathematical manuscripts, and began publishing in that area when he was only 18 years old. Unfortunately, his love of this material, and perhaps the combination of inquisitiveness and modest income, led him slightly astray, and he seems to have made off with a number of Trinity College manuscripts, which he later made the mistake of selling to a bookseller who then on-sold them to the British Museum. That was, I want to stress, because I've become very fond of him, as you do when you work on someone for a long time, his only lapse. Unlike Collier, who didn't do any thieving but who did do a large amount of forging in his career, Halliwell moved from Cambridge to London and set about establishing his credentials as a man of letters, becoming a foundation member of the Percy Society and the Shakespeare Society, and editing numerous obscure works for both institutions. Halliwell combined his scholarly and his commercial pursuits, moving between collecting rare books and manuscripts, editing them, issuing bibliographical descriptions of them, and then selling them. While he was still a student, Halliwell had some dealings with Sir Thomas Phillips, who was perhaps the greatest book and manuscript collector of the 19th century. Phillips spent a small fortune collecting an enormous range of literature, and when he was approached by Halliwell, he allowed Halliwell to visit his house at Middle Hill in Worcestershire to help classify some of the material that was held there. When he was there, Halliwell and Phillips's eldest daughter, Henrietta, fell in love. Henrietta was a great catch because not only did she stand to inherit Phillips's estate, but she'd been trained by her father to be a skilled copyist of early manuscripts. She was, her letters and diaries reveal, clever, witty, and forthright. Unfortunately for James and Henrietta, Thomas Phillips, who was at the best of times an irascible and greedy man, failed to appreciate that she was negotiating with Halliwell's doting father, and so he forbade the match. The young lovers decided to elope, and Henrietta's father's response was to disown his daughter, and he then spent the rest of his life trying to ruin James's career. There's a wonderful letter from Henrietta to James explaining that she is prepared to abandon her home and her family in order to marry him, but she needs to know first of all what kind of financial settlement he would make if he predeceased her, as she believed that she would never be reconciled with her father, which was indeed the case. James evidently satisfied Henrietta's prenuptial conditions, and they were married in August 1842. Henrietta's furious father waged psychological war on his daughter, who was his heir, and he spent a great deal of time running his estate down in order to reduce what she would inherit, and most especially he wanted to prevent his son-in-law from ever accessing his collection of books and manuscripts, which he managed through the contrivance of packing them up and shifting them from the house. Despite all of Thomas Phillips's efforts, the marriage between James and Henrietta was a very happy one, and Henrietta continued to be an enormous resource for her husband's literary labours, undertaking copious amounts of transcription as well as proofreading for him. James's career nearly came to an end in 1845 when those suspicious dealings with the Trinity College manuscripts came to light, and his prosecution was of course urged on by the constantly antipathetical Thomas Phillips. But in the end, James was, if not entirely exonerated, left relatively unscathed because the accusations couldn't be proven. He therefore continued his combination of dealing in early modern books and manuscripts and his editorial work, moving towards his Shakespeare edition, for which a prospectus appeared in Notes and Queries in 1852. Halliwell planned for an edition that would be in many ways a monument to Shakespeare. It would act as a kind of illustrated Shakespeare encyclopedia. So in the Notes and Queries note, which is a bit hard to read, but I'm going to read it out, he says, "The works of Shakespeare, the greatest of all uninspired authors, should surely be surrounded in one edition at least by the reading of the student and the pencil of the archaeological draftsman. In one edition, let every source of useful illustration be explored and rendered accessible to the student and future editor. And even if there be something redundant, much will remain suggestive of familiar explanations of obscurities and more popular uses." Drawing on his entrepreneurial side, James decided to ensure that the edition would be rare and concomitantly expensive. It was to be open for subscription and would be published in an edition limited to 150 copies, printed on the best possible paper, in a format mimicking the size of the first folio, and copiously illustrated by Frederick Fairholt, and also would be full of facsimiles of manuscripts and documents using techniques that James had perfected for some of his earlier editing work. And there is a copy in the wonderful State Library of Victoria in my hometown of Melbourne. The key to this massive editorial project is Halliwell's obsession with illustrative material. From a textual point of view, the edition is relatively conservative. Halliwell was able to draw on a large personal collection of early texts and was also given access to many held by others. Perhaps the most notable example of this was the University of Edinburgh's willingness to loan him its then apparently unique copy of the second quarto of Titus Andronicus, which resulted in Halliwell bequeathing the University Library an extensive collection of his early modern books. In that respect, the edition had the merit of Halliwell paying attention to early source texts. However, he did not do a great deal of what we would now call serious editing, relying mostly on the folio as his authoritative source text, and while stating a policy of relatively cautious emendation, Halliwell frequently changes the text without offering much explanation for why he does what he does. He did, however, make the vitally important point that the first folio had an authority that the second and third folios lacked. This was not necessarily taken for granted at the time, when many earlier editors, as I pointed out earlier on, had given the emendations and alterations of later folios some authority. This was also an indirect criticism of Collier's supposed Perkins folio, because, as Halliwell gently pointed out, even if one believed that the emendations and annotations in that book were authentic, they were in a second folio, not a first, which had to be seen as having only limited authority. In terms of explanatory matter, it's important to distinguish between Halliwell's illustrations, which are an original and fascinating attempt to contextualise everything for the reader, and his annotations, which tend, like so many previous editions, to reproduce, but with due acknowledgement, the explanations of earlier editors. Halliwell was only unusual in favouring Edward Capel, whose fascinating editorial labours, as I've already mentioned, in the late 18th century had been largely eclipsed by those of Edmund Malone when Halliwell was writing. So while Halliwell's edition is not a variorum edition, it does often cite the most obvious annotations from past editions. Looking at some pages of the edition is rather like looking at a Shakespeare encyclopedia. I'll take a relatively minor play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, as an example. Halliwell offers facsimiles of the two early Merry Wives quartos. The facsimile process for the edition was carried out by the highly skilled printer Edmund Ashby, who had collaborated with Halliwell in the past, especially in the production of a facsimile series of Shakespeare quartos. This facsimile process involved tracing the original and then reproducing it through lithography, as opposed, of course, to modern photographical processes of facsimile making, which only developed later in the 19th century. So the existence of numerous facsimiles like these of the Merry Wives of Windsor quartos adds to the rarity, expense and overall attractiveness of Halliwell's edition. Halliwell also incorporated numerous painstaking illustrations by Frederick Fairholt. Fairholt had the unique quality of being both a skilled engraver and an antiquarian. Fairholt's woodcuts are often produced through his own researches as much as by Halliwell's directions. So, just to take a fairly random example, Fairholt both illustrates and explains the partisan referred to in the opening scenes of Hamlet when Marcellus offers to strike at the ghost. Fairholt gives us a description of the particular type of weapon. He's managed to find an example at Goodrich Court, and he offers an illustration to show us what one looked like. When you look through the 16 volumes of Halliwell's edition, or even only through one of them, you can see what an achievement the edition was, in terms not just of its monumentality, but also in terms of its scope and the sheer volume of information it contains. It's true that the two main criticisms aimed at Halliwell's edition when it came out were that it was too expensive and also that it was overwhelming and that the illustrative material overpowered the actual plays. Now that second criticism is of course a perennial issue for Shakespeare editions right through to the present. Halliwell did not intend his edition to be what we might call a reading edition. It would certainly knock you out if you tried to read it in bed, but rather a reference edition. So the modern equivalent has been the Arden series, where the notes, in some people's opinion, overwhelm the text. Mind you, an Arden page looks like this, while Halliwell put his notes at the end of each act, so his actual pages of text are clean and elegant. Despite its size, though, the edition was not able to incorporate all of Halliwell's monumental research. Halliwell might be described as a compulsive collector of material related to early modern literature in general and to Shakespeare in particular. And this was manifested in an extraordinary collection of scrapbooks, which he assembled as part of the task of putting the edition together and also as part of his researches into early modern literature in general. He then decided to put these together to form a kind of supplementary archive to the edition. Creating these scrapbooks became a fundamental part of Halliwell's research procedure, and examples are now lodged at the University of Edinburgh Library, where I was looking at them a month ago, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Library, and of course the Folio Shakespeare Library, which is why I'm here in Washington. The Edinburgh University material was presented along with a considerable collection of early modern books and manuscripts, as I said before, in gratitude for the loan of the Titus Andronicus quarto. Also, Halliwell presented Edinburgh with 300 volumes of his correspondence. They may or may not have been so enthusiastic about that bit of the gift. Henrietta's diary and about 100 volumes of notes, scrapbooks, indexes and other material that was essentially devoted to Shakespeare himself as opposed to the plays. This included notes on Halliwell's meticulous and usually completely fruitless trawl through records of many counties and of sources such as court rolls, chancery and exchequer records in search of references to Shakespeare. The devotion to all things connected to Shakespeare extended to an entire volume devoted to material related to a story almost completely discredited by Halliwell's time of Shakespeare going on a drinking spree and passing out under a crab tree. Halliwell even acquired 2 volumes of material produced by the notorious late 18th century forgers Samuel and William Ireland. Samuel was a desperate and frustrated searcher for authentic Shakespearean relics, and his son William obliged by forging copious correspondence supposedly by Shakespeare and an entire play, and even a love letter from Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway, complete with a lock of Shakespeare's hair. While a similar lock has long been part of the Folger collection, along with 5 copies of the love letter, and it's been the subject of a very interesting essay by Jonathan Gill Harris. It seems that no one has noticed the companion lock and poem in Edinburgh University Library. Probably like pieces of the True Cross, I suspect, locks of Shakespeare's hair in the late 18th century. Halliwell decided to deposit the scrapbooks associated with the actual folio edition at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Library in Stratford. This was fitting because Halliwell was instrumental in establishing the trust, pushing for its acquisition of the various properties associated with Shakespeare, so he kind of pioneered the tourist industry, for which we may or may not be grateful, and also with the establishment of a library as part of the trust. And he donated many rare and precious items from his own collection to the trust as it was being established and throughout the rest of his life. When I first heard about the scrapbooks that were associated with the folio edition, I expected them to be rough and ready, perhaps like the recipes pasted into old exercise books that we have at home. Not at all. Halliwell has a series of beautifully bound volumes, roughly quarto in size. There are four main things that Halliwell collected in the scrapbooks: cross-references to ideas or images in the plays taken from other 16th and 17th century writing, actual textual variants of words or passages between different quarto and folio texts of the plays, visual illustrations of ideas or objects referred to in the plays taken from other books, and a very small number of illustrations drawn or painted by Halliwell himself. So starting with the first category, Halliwell would, for example, go looking for examples of an expression such as Hamlet's "his quietus make with a bare bodkin." So Halliwell found one in a 1635 copy of George Hakewell's Apology, first published in 1627. The first thing to say about this is that it's evidence of Halliwell's enormously wide reading, because Hakewell is far from being a mainstream author. But of course the main thing that leaps out for a modern scholar is the fact that Halliwell blithely cut the bit out of Hakewell's text that interested him and pasted it into his scrapbook, leaving behind a mutilated pamphlet. Perhaps we won't get too agitated about a chunk scissored out of an obscure pamphlet, but what about chunks cut out of the second folio and fourth quarto of Hamlet? Here are some examples as Halliwell ruminates on the scene of Hamlet's death, starting with the quarto, where the dying groan found only in the folio is written in, and then from the second folio, with a suggested ementation of "or grows" for "or crows," again written in. And there are many examples of these sliced up quarto and folio texts in the scrapbooks. I should say that the current staff at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust are rather conflicted about this evidence of devil-may-care scissor-wielding. On the one hand, they're horrified that anyone would cut up a Shakespeare quarto or folio. On the other hand, they owe a great debt to Halliwell, who is responsible for many of their unmutilated early Shakespeare texts. And in the 19th century in particular, collectors were quite prepared to make up imperfect copies of early books with pages taken from other copies, as well as with hand-drawn facsimile pages. So Halliwell, in his role as book dealer rather than editor, was happy to engage in this process. This occurred most relevantly with his purchase and resale of a first folio that's known as the George Smith folio. He resold it, at a loss, I should say, to Frederick Ouvry, offering to replace the pages that had rust holes with pages that he would happily take from what he described as the 6 imperfect copies that he had lying around. Interestingly, Halliwell said, quote, "It would be a pity to do so, the defects being insignificant and the operation one which would impair the integrity of the volume." But Ouvry did take up the offer, and Halliwell duly cut out the relevant pages and slipped them in. So scrapbooking from Shakespeare quartos and folios was not uncommon, and far from a hanging offence, however startling it might be to us. Taken together with the editing process as practised by Halliwell, this is really a notion of the archive as an assemblage that is empowering for the assembler, who takes source material as raw material to be shaped in the service of a set of ideas being tried out as part of a recontextualising process. If Halliwell cut up pieces of Shakespeare quartos and folios as part of his book dealing, it's less surprising that he might also do so as part of the scrapbook process, where the cut-out sections are related to textual issues that he was mulling over for his edition. However, when assembled within the scrapbooks as part of the accumulation of material related to the individual plays, the textual extracts become part of what I've been considering as a kind of supplementary archive for the edition. This process also bears some resemblance to the early modern practice of commonplacing. In general terms, this has been seen as a process of gathering and reordering of information, usually by writing into a commonplace book extracts that might or might not be gathered together thematically under a variety of topics. This has generally been seen as a process of recording and to some extent even rewriting the source material, either through the sifting process undertaken by the individual reader stroke writer or through scribal copying. Recent approaches have stressed that the practice of commonplacing was eclectic and that individual readers or writers compiled material for a variety of reasons using a variety of methods. Adam Smythe, for example, sees what he describes as commonplace book culture as eclectic and highly individual. Most examples of commonplace books look rather different to Halliwell's scrapbooks because commonplace books were generally manuscript compilations of extracts that were written out. Printed commonplace books, a genre that in some ways intersected with miscellanies of verse in the 17th century, were similarly compilations that looked somewhat like anthologies. But scholars have also started to explore the way that, in at least some instances, texts were cut up and reordered in the 16th and 17th centuries. And these reconstituted texts, I think, offer a suggestive way of reconsidering Halliwell's procedures. Juliette Fleming has been at the forefront of a materialist approach which has uncovered a whole range of what in the past would have been seen as transgressive and unusual instances of writing, notably graffiti, tattoos and collage. Fleming argues that what has been seen as aberrant was in fact common, and that writing was enacted in a material fashion that's also evident in the more conventional context of print, where, as is now well recognised, every individual copy of an early modern book was unique. Fleming, together with William Sherman and Adam Smythe, Adam's actually talking at Johns Hopkins, I think the week after next, so well worth going and hearing him. Sorry, they've edited a special edition of the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies devoted to the idea of Renaissance collage, which includes the process of cutting up and reconstructing books and manuscripts. In her introduction, Fleming stresses that early modern readers cut as they read and read by cutting printed books. The individual essays in this special issue examine various instances of this process in detail through a series of case studies of what Fleming succinctly calls the customising of books. Fleming's positive re-envisaging of the cut is especially pertinent to Halliwell's practice in the scrapbooks. She says, while it requires the destruction of one composite work, it creates a new work within which details of the old are revivified and given a new purpose. In his provocative revisionist account of the textual practices of the Little Gidding community, Adam Smythe focuses on what he terms the dynamism of the reconfigured gospel harmonies. The gospel harmonies were folio books that contained cut up and reordered printed texts of the four gospels. Members of the Little Gidding community, under the direction of Nicholas Ferrers, through this process of cutting and pasting, turned the printed texts into a harmonised narrative that would reconcile the differences between the gospels. One of the most controversial aspects of this activity at the time, in the 17th century, was the including of large numbers of images redeployed from a variety of sources and arranged in the harmonies with increasing artfulness. Controversial because it smacks of Catholicism. Adam Smythe stresses the way this process was characterised by an energy manifested as much in the cutting as in the pasting, so to speak, and that the reordering was dynamic and ideologically charged. Smythe lays equal stress on what is excised as well as what is created during this process, an insight that's especially relevant, I think, to Halliwell's scrapbooking. Smythe says these books are awkwardly placed on the border of destruction and creation, or to put it more precisely, these books derive their liveliness in part from an entangling of the two. One might say that the confident slicing up of the Bibles at Little Gidding is replicated in Halliwell's insouciant use of what by the 19th century, and certainly by us, were books seen in almost the same light, Shakespeare, folios and quartos. A description of Halliwell at work towards the end of his life captures some of the paradoxes of this process. This is a quote: "Along one side of the antechamber of his study stretches what Mr. Phillips has named his book bin. Every afternoon his habit is to look over a score of books, cut out of each the fractions he can use, and throw the rest as refuse into his mammoth wastebasket. Halliwell's process of repurposing text cut from his collection of early modern books can also be seen in relation to the 19th century idea of the scrapbook as a form of information ordering. This activity has been studied in relation to the scrapbook ordering of information gathered from newspapers in Ellen Gruber Garvey's Writing with Scissors. Great title. Garvey notes that scrapbooks are the direct ancestors of our digital information management, and that 19th century readers adapted to the proliferation of print by cutting it up and saving it, reorganising it, putting their own stamp on it, and sometimes recirculating it. This is a process which Garvey describes as performing archivalness, an apt description of at least one aspect of Halliwell's scrapbooking, although his stretches beyond cutting and pasting. We're nowadays perhaps more used to the repurposing of illustrations, though responses to these also veers between the happy adoption of illustrations removed from books of flora and fauna etchings and repurposed as nice prints for our walls, and horror at the vandalism practiced upon books that were intended themselves to be encyclopedic repositories. A good example from the Halliwell scrapbooks is the illustration he found for the reference in Othello to the men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. In the scrapbook, Halliwell places a hand-coloured engraving which he describes as rare. In the edition, the illustration is taken from a 1609 masque held at Stuttgart by the Duke of Württemberg. Finally, Halliwell, who was quite a decent amateur artist, popped in a few sketches and watercolours of his own. This one had me puzzled until I recalled Prospero's threat to Ferdinand. Sea water shalt thou drink, thy food shall be the fresh brook mussels. Typical Halliwell that he should seek out and illustrate this with a giant freshwater mussel from Sir Henry Dryden's lake. Sir Henry was an eccentric antiquarian who lived at Cannons Ashby, where the lake still exists, and I assume the mussels do too. Having assembled the scrapbooks and then produced the final volume of the edition in 1865, Halliwell devoted himself to writing an ever-expanding biography of Shakespeare, having produced his first biographical attempt as far back as the 1840s. The scrapbooks and the folio edition were a kind of monument to Halliwell's obsessive archiving, but the biography in its final form was highly regarded and used well into the 20th century. Personally, though, Halliwell's life went off the rails when Henrietta had a bad fall from a horse in 1872, which resulted in some kind of acquired brain injury, as a result of which she went into a nursing home until her eventual death in 1879. Halliwell went into something like a depression. He moved to a place near Brighton and built himself an eccentric set of wooden buildings he referred to as wigwams. He also proclaimed himself to be over the whole enterprise of scholarship, devising a postcard he sent out to inquirers which eloquently expressed his current state of mind. He labels this nose-thumbing, "my reply to those idiots who asked me to resume my literary studies." He did in time resume, but I think that this eloquent statement of the cheeky ennui that can overtake even the most devoted of editors and scholars is where I'm going to conclude. I'm happy to answer.
That's what I was going to say.
Questions?
We have time for questions. Generate discussion, Eric.
Could you say anything about his relationship with his printers? Because it seems like these scrapbooks are sort of a penultimate stage, and that if he'd had a better, printer, he might have been able to do without them, sort of funnel them all into print.
Well, sort of two sides of that. He had a very good relationship with his printers, and in fact, when the final volume of the folio edition came out, he had a kind of banquet for the men of the press in London. There's quite extensive correspondence about exactly how he wanted the individual volumes to look. But in terms of, could he have put more in and not needed the scrapbooks? My sense of what is going on with the scrapbooks is that scrapbooking is an essential part of his method of doing research. So there are kind of two sorts of scrapbooks, and because I wrote this before I had a chance to look at the Folio material, there's kind of archiving scrapbooks like the ones at the Birthplace Trust that are part of the edition. And there's what we would now, you know, stick on our computers and our phones, take photos of as kind of, you know, work in progress. And I don't think there could ever be an edition. It's a kind of a Kashuban sort of sense of what he's up to, that he got stuff out in print, but he would never really have wanted it all to be incorporated because it kept growing. So the Folger's actually got some very late scrapbooks where he kept revising his biography. It came out in about 5 different editions. The very, very last kind of days of his life, he's still sticking bits into a scrapbook that are about Shakespeare that I don't think would ever really have had a place in a book. But so I think that's what's going on there.
Yes, Bill, we're going to repeat the question too because of this new procedure.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Right.
I forgot to do it. Bill, yeah.
I'm aware of at least 2 major Victorian bibliophiles who cut up books. One was John Ruskin, and the other was Philip Augustus Hanrot. And they achieved some notoriety during their lifetime, even for the kinds of things that they did. How did his contemporaries respond to what Halliwell Phillips was doing, or did they know that he was doing this?
So this is a question about, so Bill's first pointed out that there are 2 figures, I know Ruskin, I don't know your other person, who were famous for cutting bits out of books, I assume. Did Ruskin cut illustrations out rather than text, or?
Yes, and it tended to be very, very, not Shakespeare, but early illustrated books and manuscripts. Yeah.
On the whole, nobody realised that this was what Halliwell was doing, except insofar as Halliwell, as I said, was a book dealer as well as an editor and bibliographer. So he certainly had correspondence with people about that very common practice of, you know, how perfect do you want your book to be? Shall I slip a few pages from something else into it? No, you're talking. Yeah. That quotation about him throwing stuff into his big waste bin comes from very late in his life. And prior to that, I don't think anyone was paying any attention to what he was doing with his books. He had a very keen eye for collecting early in his career, not just for pilfering, but for actual collecting. So I also think, you know, there's a sense in which dealers see books differently, I think. I mean, on the one hand, they may see them as, you know, sacrosanct at a certain point, but the opposite at another point. So I wonder whether there's, you know, the dealer Halliwell Phillips, as opposed to the, you know, collector bibliographer Halliwell Phillips, I think was much happier to do the chopping and shifting and chucking away even. As you see often in rebound books that have what we now might think of as rather wonderful pages from, you know, 18th century pages that wrap around earlier books when they're, you know, that kind of process, I think, is at work too.
Well, another name comes to mind right at the very end of the century, Thomas J. Wise, the Folger.
Oh, yeah.
Doing this sort of thing at the British Museum.
Yes.
Slicing things out of books to perfect his own copies.
Yes. More nefarious. I mean, I think, you know, I want to put Halliwell in a slightly different category to that one, but I can also see the connections. Yeah.
There's a very interesting theme in your talk of adding and subtracting, and the ways in which the early examples that you gave us subtract from Shakespeare what was not to be permitted as not sufficiently moral or not sufficiently contemporary. And the now what we would regard as a sort of editorial insouciance, just stick in what would be relevance now, of course, smack of presentism. So that's one kind of addition and subtraction. And then we have at the other end of the spectrum this sort of massive, endless, almost a concatenation of foundational materials, which you say some of which got into this reference edition with almost a sort of parallel text
running concurrently with the text of Shakespeare, which you say was rather conservatively edited, but still edited. You know, perhaps I'm working too hard to try to make this into a trajectory, but it does strike me that there's a very different, perhaps period-specific set of attitudes that are at play here that would bring you these different sorts of additions and subtractions. I mean, I understand that Halliwell may be in a class by himself, but surely the archival or the foundational impulse would be something that he would understand as needed or appreciated. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is quite fascinating about him in his historical context is that he's sort of at the end of a tradition of editing, and that Cambridge text, which is the Cambridge Shakespeare in the 1860s, is in a way the beginning of the new tradition of editing, insofar as that, you know, that's a text based upon much more scientific collating, well, not scientific, but, you know, much more meticulous collating than previous editors would have thought was relevant or necessary. So I think he's like that Victorian notion of indefatigable assemblage, and he's seeing a kind of shift going on, I think, to some degree around him, that in terms of editing is working in a slightly different direction, but in terms of things like the biography, for example, doesn't. So, you know, his biography is still quite well thought of. But then if you think of how Shakespeare biography works through the 20th century, it also works kind of accumulatively. I mean, until you suddenly get to, you know, people like Stephen Greenway who get into trouble for making too much up. But prior to that, we've got, you know, that notion of give me the facts. So you've got those kind of facts. Is it Chambers who did the... So Schoenbaum does, anyway, Schoenbaum does Shakespeare, A Documentary Life, which is kind of Halliwell Phillips-ish in its sense that he's just found everything that's got anything to do with Shakespeare, and he's just stuck them all in the book, because you don't write a conventional biography of Shakespeare because there isn't enough material to hand, although that doesn't stop people. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think...
It's very helpful, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, thank you. How are the places that hold his scrapbooks today classify them? Do they consider them to be manuscripts and books?
It's a very, very good question. They actually consider them to be headaches, I think. So Edinburgh, they're kind of a mess because there's a sort of... so they're classified as manuscripts in Edinburgh, and the finding list, supposed finding list that was typed up in the 1960s is no help at all. The Birthplace Trust treats them with, as I said, kind of ambivalent reverence, and I think they're possibly classified as books rather than manuscripts. Folger, they're definitely classified under a manuscript call number.
Except for the ones that are classified as art.
Okay, good, good. And I noticed that, in fact, at least one that I was looking at yesterday, it's quite, I don't know why this was done, because almost at random, just one engraved map has been removed and recatalogued, you know, as a map and put somewhere as a map. This is in a volume full of engraved maps. I can only assume that this was a rarer and more wonderful map.
There's a whole history of... Aaron Blake, head of collection information services at the Folger.
Great.
One of the things we're looking at is how these have been classified, because things that were predominantly pictures became art. Those scrapbooks are in the art collection.
Yeah.
Ones primarily in words are in the manuscript collection.
Yeah.
Ones that were meant to be turned into scrapbooks but never were are called scrap boxes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the loose stuff. Yeah.
And Halliwell Phillips himself changed his mind about some of the pictures, so while conserving the art scrapbooks, we discovered that he had different pictures underneath what he had pasted something over. So there's... You're going to have plenty to look at.
Yes, I've been doing very well. It's great. The The only thing we couldn't... So if someone was asking me, I think, sorry, not at this talk, about kind of reuniting the cut-up pages, a task which I'm delighted to say I will never have anything to do with. But I was exercising, I think, 3/4 of the Folger staff today and yesterday, because so at one of the Folger, the very first Folger scrapbook I opened had a page carefully cut out of Rawleigh's History of the World. Now the Folger's got 4 copies of various imprints of the History of the World, and Schoenbaum, who's the person who wrote the history of biographies written about Shakespeare, Schoenbaum's got this intriguing footnote that dates back to probably the late 60s, where he says that the librarian at the Folger told him that this page from Rawleigh's History of the World was cut out of an otherwise perfect copy of the History of the World that the Folger has, without giving it a call number or anything. So we've now gone through all of the Folger's copies of the History of the World, and certainly can't find the one that the page was cut out of. So, you know, even where you would think that it would be really simple to match page to book, everyone's scratching their heads. So, but you know, my point is, in fact, that that's a kind of false quest to try to match things in that way. But that's not being true to the purpose of what Halliwell Phillips was up to, and I think what he was up to is actually really interesting, both in relation to kind of early modern and in relation to the 19th century and in relation to current ideas about editing and material book history.
Okay, Susan.
Just to follow up on that, this is just speculation, but as I think about what I would have done myself in his situation, but today, do you think if he had access to a scanner or a Xerox machine, he would have been satisfied with a facsimile that he could paste in, or do you think he wanted, because I would be satisfied with a facsimile.
Yeah. He was really interested in, so he was very good on facsimiles. So he actually published a whole series of quarto facsimiles, which was quite early on. So he was good, well, when I say he was good at it, you know, the facsimile maker was good at it, but Halliwell was quite keen on it. I think he was mostly keen on it for mercenary reasons, because you could sell those early facsimile editions, you know, at a good price, and you could also, if you were very naughty, use facsimile pages to make up deficient pages in, you know, in genuine books. I just can't. I was taking my photos today, thinking, so what I'm doing is like what Halliwell Phillips was doing. I'm just snapping away madly, really, as we all do. I don't think, if you'd given him a smartphone, I don't think he would have felt that was at all satisfactory. I think he wanted to code, which is why I'm very much in accord with people like Juliette Fleming and Adam Smythe about that the process of cutting is different to the process of reproducing. So, yeah.
Okay.
I think my two-part question comes together. I think you mentioned earlier the things you looked at before you came to the Folger were quartos, and I saw you looking at the Folio the other day at the Folger. And I'm wondering if, does it seem that at any particular time, Halliwell Phillips had 2 or 3 scrapbooks under process, and you put this kind of thing over here, and that kind of thing over there, so that they're kind of organized?
Oh yeah, they're quite different kinds. So the Edinburgh ones are also nearly all folios. So the folios are kind of rough. So I would call them kind of research scrapbooks, and the beautifully bound quartos at the Birthplace Trust that are arranged in order of play. So, you know, if you call up Hamlet, there are, 12 volumes, and they're beautiful, like they're really nicely bound. They actually have stamped titles on the bindings, whereas the big folio ones are much rougher. So I would say that there are 2 completely different categories, and sometimes things migrate from one to the other, but I agree with you. I think that he's got them piled high as he does his, and his work is cumulative. It's also, so instead of index cards, instead of, you know, whatever other process you've got, through the years, there are more and more of them, because every time he sees something that's relevant, he cuts it out and sticks it in. And he's classified them, so they're in categories, various categories, the big scrapbooks. And what you're saying about the Folgers, you know, the Folgers also got what were in drawers in his study, which are now in boxes, all sort of ready to be, ready to be pasted in, but not there.
Oh, no, I was thinking of the actual objects.
Yes, yeah, that's...
An example of something that's mentioned in Shakespeare, and he would go find an example of that thing, and those are now on little boxes.
Yeah, but he also has, and there's stuff that's also paper things that are also not pasted in yet too. So it's all, as I say, I think, you know, on his deathbed he's still thinking, what will I put in now? Bless him.
What was his method? Did he choose a play and then look for things related to that play, or was it higgledy-piggledy? Whatever he ran across, he matched it to the play he thought it should be matched to?
I'm not absolutely certain. So for the Folio edition, he edited in volume by volume, so to speak. So I think there he was, you know, it's Hamlet, and I'm looking for everything to do with Hamlet. For the material that's everything to do with Shakespeare, I think it kind of accumulates as he goes. So there's a really nice little piece on him by J.A.B. Somerset, who was a foundation of Reed. You know, Reed's the Records of Early English Drama project. And Halliwell is a kind of precursor to Records of Early English Drama, because he went from county records office to county records office, and he would write down whatever he found there, and that was this kind of, you know, that was whenever he happened to be. If he was in Colchester, then let's have a look at the record office in Colchester. So there it was just kind of everything that was anything. I think for the editing of the plays, it was rather more methodical, play by play.
Can you tell us anything about how the various collections of scrapbooks ended up in these various places?
Oh yeah, it's quite simple, because the Edinburgh stuff he actually left in his will. He also left Edinburgh a lot of his actual early modern books, and then he was such a great guy. He was very keen on the library at Plymouth, and he left the Plymouth Library this massive collection of early modern books. And the Plymouth Library, in its wisdom, decided in the 1960s that it'd sell them. And Edinburgh University stepped in and bought them, so they kind of doubled their Phillips collection. The Birthplace Trust material, he was instrumental in setting up the Birthplace Trust Library, so they got theirs as part of that connection. Unfortunately, came to a bit of a sort of sticky end, because there were all these quarrels at Stratford over the running of the Birthplace Trust, and he ended up kind of cold shouldering them, but not before he'd given them quite a lot of material. The Folger bought theirs, and quite early on, I think. So they came from, they went up for sale probably in the late 1890s, and I now can't remember whether the Folgers bought them or whether but anyway, so the Folgers acquired by purchase, as opposed obviously by bequest, because it wasn't there when he died.
Go ahead, August.
Did he have a team of people the way Murray did for the dictionary?
It's a really good question. His team basically consisted of Henrietta, who worked furiously for him. She left this quite wonderful diary that is in fact in Edinburgh. And I don't, you know, people talk about, you know, Victorian men of letters who do so much. This is the Victorian woman of letters who gave birth to a number of children and helped raise them, and managed to do enormous amounts of transcribing, proofreading, compiling. But as far as I can make out, he would sometimes do that thing that a lot of people did in the 19th century, where he would write to someone at the Bodleian and say, I want these 4 pages of this book, could you write it out for me? So, but not a team like the dictionary team. No, not at all.
I was going to say, because of a couple of the comments too, that, and starting back with both Lauren's that addition and subtraction and then yours, Bill, about other people collecting and scrapbooking, that they're also, and I know this isn't, I think the whole project is very interesting. This is not your focus, but I think that somebody, this project could give to kind of the technology of writing and research. I mean, there's a lot that's already been done on this, but there seems to be different formats. I'm thinking of people scrapbooking not in the 18th century for knowledge production and collections. That was also making me think about where they end up in classifications, because that's more. And some of the questions that came up, because I think when we're writing on a very meta level, we're always taking and subtracting from different things to create our own kind of perspective and take on something. And the individuality of assembling the pieces, whether we're doing it figuratively, where he was doing it literally, as well as bringing in. So, I mean, it's an interesting, to take even a higher step back and look at this in a meta level, I think, and then compare it to perhaps other figures and look at similarities according to periods and then differences that emerge because of the tools, and also because of what the tools do for many of us in terms of what we think is we're capable of. Because the tools, I think, also sometimes affect the way we collect and synthesize.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm particularly taken by all the work that's been done recently on Renaissance commonplacing, which I think is a really interesting parallel to simply because that's what he's working on, and that the parallels seem to me to be really kind of crying out to be made, and people have come up with much more sophisticated notions of what commonplacing in the 16th and 17th centuries really involved, you know, book wheels and notions of kind of eclectic bringing together. But, well, you know, Bill, I do take your point on the one hand, but on the other hand, kind of returning to that notion of, you know, what if Halliwell Phillips had had a smartphone, or, you know, what if the 17th century commonplaces had a laptop? I would want to say that it's not the same for all kinds of reasons. I mean, there are similarities, but that the process isn't the same.
I'm sure that's right, but at the same time, the similarities are the way he took his notes and the way we take our notes now are quite striking. I mean, speaking for myself, I always carry my iPhone to the library. If there's a long passage that I want to take note of, I photograph it and pop it into a note-taking program. And then if there's other stuff, I may type underneath that, or I may even draw on the computer.
Yep.
It's quite a similar process.
There's also an interesting question of, is he consuming or is he producing? Right? Because the people at Little Gidding, they thought they were producing. In fact, they call it printing with scissors. This is printing with scissors, they say. And you know, they think they're improving it. They're rearranging the text. They're illustrating it. The page is decorated with drawn lines and so on and so forth. So they think they're producing, but
producing something for others,
for other people. And you know, people requested bespoke copies of what they did at Little Charles First, what they did at Little Gidding, for example. But I think that's an interesting question: is he consuming or is he producing?
Yeah. I guess the book dealing side would say that the two are inseparable in a way. That, you know, that what he's putting out depends partly on what he's bringing in and cutting up. And I suspect the editing, and that he would say that the edition and the biography couldn't be what they were without this sort of endless chopping up. So it's not exactly the same, but that would be the sort of parallel process.
And you could, the tension too between preserving in the sense of collection and producing, and then also as you're preserving, there's destruction.
Yeah.
You know, in the.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we have time for, do we have one more question? No.
Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Paul for
Thank you for having me.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.